Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to turn to our final panel of the morning, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dean Graham.
Good afternoon. It's now noon, so good afternoon. As Professor Levine said, I'm Tiffany Graham. I'm on the faculty here at Touro, and I would like to introduce Michael Gilberg and Robert Sanchez. So, starting with Michael Gilberg. Michael Gilberg
I'm sorry, the next panel is going to be starting. If everyone could just please take a seat.
Michael Gilberg is a special education attorney and autistic self-advocate who was first diagnosed at 18. Michael devotes his legal career to representing children with disabilities to ensure they get the appropriate education that they are entitled to under the law. Michael serves on numerous boards and committees and has years of political and policy experience in government and advocating for disability and public policy in New York State and Westchester County. Robert Sanchez is a real estate salesperson at Christie's International Real Estate Group who is focused on finding unique commercial properties for investors in the New York market. He currently runs MouthMedia Network, which is a podcast network, and he serves on the faculty of Fordham Law School supporting their entrepreneurship programs. Passionate about empowering others, he volunteers for Law Help New York and serves on the board of Autism Communities. So we will start off our remarks today with Michael. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'm sorry, the START CLE code is HGT876. Once again, H like Harry, G like game, T like Tom, 876.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I'm not used to the microphone, and I don't know where the timer is, so I'm going to time myself. As Professor Graham said, my name is Michael Gilberg. I'm a special ed attorney, and I was diagnosed with autism when I was 18 and got into this field to help others and others avoid some of the challenges I had. Listening to one of the judges before talk about IDEA was very enlightening, since obviously that's what I do, although she said the state review office is for the city, it's for the whole state, but that's another conversation for another day. As I said, I'm a special ed attorney, and I serve on the board of COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, which is the professional organization of special ed attorneys, and just got back from our annual conference in the DC area where we were lobbying Congress on special ed funding and making sure that they don't cut it. I like to tell a little bit of my story and then the law. As I always say, as I think Stephen Shore, my friend Stephen Shore, who should be here today, always says, you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Everybody with autism is different. If I had $1 for every time someone said, but you're not like Temple Grandin. No, I'm not like Temple Grandin, because I can't fill a room like Temple Grandin. Everybody with autism is unique and one of a kind. And when I was growing up in the 80s, people thought autism was kids sitting in the corner banging his head against the wall, not speaking. And so they didn't think I had autism. I went through special ed. I went through all the wrong programs, got all the wrong services, never got what I would call an appropriate education. I was also too smart for my own good, still am. And it wasn't until I was 18 and got to college that I made the effort to catch myself up and fill in the gaps that I was lacking, and graduated college and law school. And this was after 6th grade, when my mother was told, throw him away, he'll never graduate high school, by a school social worker. Unfortunately, I looked up that social worker about a decade ago, because now with the internet you can find anybody. Nobody can hide anymore. But he had died of cancer a few years earlier, so I didn't get the chance or the satisfaction to tell him he was wrong. But as I've always said, I made the decision to make my life better and to improve my life from where they said I was going to be. Not everybody has that motivation or has parents who are going to help them do that. And for that reason, I got into special ed to help children get services, because what the judge said before, it's shocking how they'll just kick the can down the road, or if parents can't afford an attorney, they will just delay on parents, whether it's right or wrong, and parents don't get the services they need for their child. And we all know it's a lot easier when you do early intervention than when you do it later to teach children skills. going back to the point is that, everybody with autism is unique, and you can't fit everybody into a neat little box. I've often heard people say, well, this is our autism program. But everybody with autism is different. I've been told I'm very non-autistic autistic because I don't have a lot of autistic behaviors. And when I do those inventories on autism, I always come up just on the line. And so it's like being, as I wrote an article once, half neurotypical, half autistic. So the idea that everybody with autism can be educated the same way is a misnomer. I think one thing we need to do as a society with disability in general is reduce the stigma. I see way too many parents in society say, well, I don't want my child to have this label. The label is bad. And again, there shouldn't be a shame in the label. We're all a mixture of many identities, disability, religion, race, gender. People need to stop thinking that a label defines you. I appreciated what the other judge said before about how she didn't let her label as a Hasidic woman define her in terms of becoming a judge, and how she broke barriers. And I think the point is that there's so much people don't understand about autism and disability in general, and so many people who have what is called internalized ableism, shame from disability. And I think there's too much of that. I see every day when I represent families being told by the school, well, we assumed the school was doing the right thing. And I represent families across New York and Connecticut. And unfortunately, one of the big challenges we face is that families don't know what they don't know. I always say being a parent is one of the most important jobs in the world, and one of the only ones you don't need a license for. Most jobs, you got to get a credential, attorney, doctor, what have you. Anybody can be a parent. And some parents are very good, and some parents don't know what they're doing. And the problem is every child is entitled to an education, where, as the judge said, regardless of their parents. And unfortunately, in a place like New York City, which, as I said, I'm on the board of COPA, which is the National Special Ed Organization for Parent Attorneys and Advocates, New York City is one of the worst in the nation for compliance. And delaying things years on end because they don't want to spend the money, and they've gotten only worse in the past couple of years. Where they would settle cases a few years ago, they now litigate them, or they'll litigate a case and say, we have no case to put on, but we're not going to settle, even though they have no actual case to put on. So it's a challenge, and we need to do better by children in this world, with autism in particular, again. And I think I've had people say to me things like, well, you're autistic, but you don't seem autistic. I don't know, or you don't look autistic. I don't know what looking autistic means. I can look Jewish. I can't look autistic. So I'm not really sure what that means. There's no autism look. Or I've heard women I know who are told that they're too pretty to be autistic. Again, it doesn't make sense. So I think we as a society need to understand, and we also need to understand that and I've seen this with people with autism, there's people who have different perspectives on things and be able to agree. And I unfortunately, being in politics, see this too much. Learn how to disagree respectfully. And I think part of the challenge we face now, and I don't want to get too political, is there's a lot of drama in the autism world over RFK Jr.'s appointment, and a lot of controversy there within the community, within the self-advocate community. Like I said, I serve on the board of many organizations. The National Autism Society, I'm on their self-advocate board, and while most of us agree, there's some people on that board who have differing opinions about vaccines and RFK Jr., and I think this is a time to really be mindful of these things because, as somebody who has done most of what is on his list, I was offended when he said autistic people are never going to do, and he ran through a list of things. I think the only one on the list I've never done is write a poem, because I have no interest in poetry. So I think that, we have to be mindful that most autistic people, everybody has limits, I always say. And, we have to encourage children to be their best, but also be realistic. As I tell people, when I was 11, I wanted to be third baseman for the Mets. Then I realized a couple years later I was uncoordinated, unathletic, and that was not a realistic dream, although right now, the way the Mets are, who knows? Although I'm a little old. But as I got older, I realized that this was not a realistic goal, and I ended up becoming a lawyer, just because we have to balance kids with giving them good opportunities, balance kids with giving them the chance to reach for their dreams, but also be realistic in what those abilities are. You know, certain disabilities will preclude certain jobs. If you're in a wheelchair, you're not going to probably be a police officer chasing suspects, although some of those wheelchairs go really fast. But the point is that certain jobs do limit certain things. And so we have to be mindful of that. I think that, you know, we have to just do more about educating society about autism. I know part of what was said at the topic, and this was kind of weird, was involuntary commitment, and that's a big issue in the autism world. People who are being committed against their will, and especially when they're young, if their parents don't have the proper education on what they need. I've seen many cases where parents are told, like my mother, just throw your son away, forget about him. He's never gonna amount to anything. But I always tell the story that when I was growing up, I had one friend in 6th grade when this happened, and he told the social worker something in private that was not to be repeated. The social worker told the entire class. The kid never trusted an adult again, and the day before his 16th birthday committed suicide. And I always say they failed me, but they failed him worse. And suicide is actually, and I don't know that he was autistic or what, I'm just making the segue, but the leading cause of death for autistic people without an intellectual disability is suicide from loneliness and depression. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of, that disability very often, other disabilities lead to depression. Depression doesn't have to just be a condition of its own, but feeling different, feeling isolated, feeling outside of other people can lead to depression. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of, you know, and I do a lot of police trainings as well, because there's big issues with autistic people and the police. There was just a shooting in Maryland of a guy living in an autistic community where the police showed up and he was having a mental health episode, and rather than de-escalate or have someone there to deal with it, they shot and killed him. And unfortunately, this happens way too often. So I do police trainings. I'm doing one tomorrow in Westchester on how to de-escalate the situation, that they need to not go for their gun right away if the person's autistic, because the odds that that autistic person is going to have a gun are pretty close to zero. And with that, I think my time is up. So I will.
All right. So, hi, I'm Rob Sanchez. I'm also autistic, diagnosed at 34. Can you all hear me, or is this better? Right here? Okay. Yeah. So first, most of the background that was given of me is just what's publicly out there. I run a stealth startup that focuses on mathematical development and algorithms. And almost everybody in the company is autistic. So we just aren't very public about what we're doing, so I keep the rest of my resume out there as well. I'm grateful for the opportunity to brain dump on something I'm very interested in, and this is also close to home in that my grandmother is a paranoid schizophrenic. She's lucky enough to have a house and unlucky enough to believe that the house is trying to kill her. And she spent the winter in her garage in the backseat of her car. And in the state of California, there was nothing we could do as the family to help her. And so it's an interesting area in that there's no good answers, but it's really important to understand what exists, why, and where it came from. So the idea behind civil commitment, it's based on two things: the police power and the idea of parens patriae, which I can't pronounce anything of in the Latin realm. But basically, the state has the responsibility of caring for individuals under their jurisdiction. There is no commitment interest, which is an interesting kind of nuance here, in that civil commitment is seen as doing right by the individual. Last year, James Fisher spoke about Elizabeth Kite and the feeble-minded menace while here, and I think that is a very interesting starting point when you're talking about civil commitment. The foundations for a lot of what we're looking at is an evolution out of eugenics-based ideas and out of the idea of throwing away people who have intellectual disabilities or who are a danger to themselves or others. What was it? Intellectual or developmental. Yeah. So we're leaving behind warehousing and we're moving towards deinstitutionalization. In 1972, the mental hygiene laws were passed. They set up frameworks for civil commitment for individuals who were mentally ill and individuals who were developmentally disabled. And around 1975, O'Connor v. Donaldson basically said a non-dangerous person who is capable of surviving safely and freedom cannot be confined solely on the basis of mental illness. In 1977, we, as New York, set up the Office of Mental Health, the office, what became the Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, as well as a few other departments to kind of address some of the issues that were here. And then around the same time, Addington v. Texas, civil commitment is a significant deprivation of liberty. Due process requires a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is elevated. What I think is really interesting here is that because we aren't seeing this as punishment and because we're not seeing civil commitment as something that's done to an individual versus something that's done for an individual, it actually has a lower standard than criminal commitment. And it's justified in part because it's believed that professionals are involved in the diagnosis of these individuals and the concern of their family and friends should be enough to counteract unjust deprivation of liberty. So I think that I'll come back to that later on, but I think it's interesting, and that's one of the ways that criminal versus civil is parsed when it comes to commitment. And then additionally, Jones v. U.S. held that not guilty by reason of insanity is completely separate from criminal punishment. So it is entirely possible to receive not guilty by reason of insanity and serve far longer, and in some cases indefinitely, than if you had been sentenced and had served your time. And it's also not found, you can serve your time and then also be committed. They are treated separately. Civil commitment is not considered punishment. In 1980, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act set up the right for the DOJ to review civil commitment at a systemic level and to work towards providing relief. We will see what happens to that under the current framework, but that the idea was that it is the government's right and responsibility to look at how we're dealing with people who require this help. And then Kansas v. Hendricks, I already covered that one, sorry. That was the jail sentence. In New York, we had Olmstead v. LC, unjustified isolation of people with disabilities is a form of discrimination prohibited by Title II. And you must provide community-based services instead when appropriate. And we'll get into kind of whether that's happening or not. And then we had Kendra's Law, which provided for the assisted outpatient treatment. And it also set up boundaries around forced medication and allowed somebody who has outpatient treatment under civil commitment to be detained if necessary for short periods of time. Following that, I think it's interesting to note that Kendra's Law came because of an attack on a young woman in the subway. She was pushed in front of a train and ended up dying. That was a horrific example of what may happen when an individual is a danger to others. But the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration did a review of violence when it comes to mental illness, and they found that only 4% of violent crimes are linked to psychopathology, and that study is from 2016. So a very small number of violent crimes proportionally are from individuals who would be eligible to be committed. And then If you're in New York, you probably know about Willowbrook. If you're related to this community at all, you know about Willowbrook. The 2025 was the 50th anniversary of Willowbrook being shut down. And the consent decree that came out of Willowbrook has pushed us towards deinstitutionalization, which is a double-edged sword, which, again, I'll talk about in a little bit. So where are we right now? Right now, Rittler v. Searles, which came out in '88, says that automatic 90-day commitment is unconstitutional. So there is a framework in place. I won't go into all of the specifics, but there's a framework in place for review, diagnoses, and commitment, and holding over 72 hours is not allowed for an involuntary commitment without a diagnosis unless that individual is then referred for criminal charges or so on. And the other big thing that came out was the idea of dangerousness to self and others. So in Gonzalez v. State of New York, it was found that vague psychoses, suicidal ideation, or vague threats to others is not sufficient. It has to move more towards action. And then, as I discussed with Kendra's law, there's limits on forced medication, emergency detention, and there's a move towards assisted outpatient treatment. Additionally, no religious grounds objections for treatment can be denied without a court order. No surgery, shock treatment, or experimentation on an individual who's committed are allowed without consent, and there is no right to challenge consent. There are now regulations on physical restraint, although evidence has been coming out that in schools those regulations are not fully being complied with. And overall, we're moving towards a more humanistic approach to this topic. So with that being said, there's some major issues still at play. I'll try to go through them very quickly. There has been evidence of prosecutors and others shopping between criminal and civil liability when it comes to commitment to get people off of the streets in their way of thinking. There is a conflation of developmental disability with mental illness, and not a good way of separating the two. Repeated studies have found racial disparities, due process issues, and coercion issues when it comes to juveniles especially, but large populations in New York State. And there is evidence that your privileged status is the privileged status of the institutions makes it difficult to recover compensation if you're improperly committed, or to free yourself if you're improperly committed. Additionally, it's extremely costly. The barriers of proof, the requirements for expert testimony, changes in Medicaid and insurance, and the regime of privilege for private hospitals and so on makes it very difficult if you're on the wrong side of this. Additionally, we have major issues with access to resources, especially in the juvenile area when it comes to this. There's this concept of the revolving door of care. Because there are not enough resources for individuals, they are often committed instead. And the idea of least restrictive methods of helping individuals who need help are a fiction. They're rhetoric only due to the constraints. So often what happens is individuals who are eligible for home-based or community-based services do not receive them and are institutionalized instead. There's also a move towards deferral to the clinician at the same time as lowering who is allowed to give an opinion on the mental state. We just lowered it to allow nurse practitioners plus physicians instead of requiring 2 physicians. There's also major issues in the housing market, And getting back to something, and I can probably wrap here, but getting back to the idea of the relying on the concern of family and friends, leaves open to misuse of civil commitment, either for personal belief, religious belief being enforced on a family member, someone with autism not being helped or treated, but instead being discarded. There's even, so Schoolcraft in 2009 was an NYPD officer who was brought in handcuffs to Jamaica Hospital and committed. He was a whistleblower who was, he was giving testimony and providing evidence of quota-based policing in New York City, and the department had him institutionalized instead as a way of silencing him. So there are still major issues that we need to overcome, but overall we're moving in the right direction. There's a lot more work to be done on the physical resources and access.
Okay, thank you.
To what Rob said about restraint in schools, it's a huge issue that we see with students still being restrained unnecessarily or forcefully in ways that they're not supposed to, with the issue being when the student's a danger to themselves or others. In particular, one issue is students who run in the street and elope, and how to restrain them humanely. So that is an ongoing issue in schools.
So we have a little bit of time for questions. We have about a little under 4 minutes. So are there any questions out there?
Thank you. This question is directed at you, Rob. In about a year or two ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the Office of Mental Health came out with guidance for providers across New York State as it pertained to the interpretation of imminent danger and the ability to hold someone in a psychiatric emergency room. And from a provider's perspective, it was a loosening, if you will, of the interpretation of it in order to protect individuals who might not have been in imminent danger, but otherwise might not have been able to care for themselves. And I'm just interested in your perspective, if you're familiar with that guidance, what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so I may think about this differently.
Yeah, the mic, you can move the mic.
I'm not a practitioner in this area. This is just an area of interest, so I'm not as fully up to date on everything. I have read what you're talking about, though. My perspective comes more from a personal side. So my wife hears voices and also is part of the Hearing Voices Network, which provides support for individuals. One of the things that they struggle with, which I think pertains a little bit to this, is it's difficult for an individual with suicidal thoughts to get support because there are so many mandatory reporters, and because the loosening of the standards makes it so that they may end up committed just by mentioning that they're dealing with something. And then you couple that with a lot of the psychiatric medications have an increase of suicidal thoughts when you're weaned off of them and so on. There's a lot of issues around that, and there's not necessarily a safe space because of the loosening of the standards. So that's kind of an unintentional impact in my mind that I think has come out of that, and there isn't a good solution right now. I think there's so many levers and so much complexity in this space that there's not a lot of foresight or forethought put into these decisions and guidelines.
Thank
We
you.
have time for one quick question. One more quick question, if there is one. If not, I have one for Michael. You talked about being diagnosed as an adult, and we have a sense of the obligations that are owed.
If you consider 18 an adult.
Okay. We do have a sense of the obligations that we owe to kids, but what would you say about the obligations that we owe to adults in terms of providing support for people who have been diagnosed?
Well, I think we need to provide support in the way that each person needs it, and everybody's needs are going to be different. Some people might need financial support, or rather job training. Some people might need housing support. Some people, it varies. I think we have to give, as I say, each person the maximum chance to be independent possible. I always say you have a choice between letting the person become a taxpayer or a tax recipient of public benefits. And, the services we give them and the maximum chance to be independent, you can turn that person from a tax recipient into a taxpayer, which is good for society all the way around.
All right, thank you. All right, so we are at our end.
Just one thought on that is one of the populations I think that is least supported is women on the autism spectrum who also may not have been diagnosed already. Because of our society and the way we are set up and the way that we diagnose autism, there is a very large population of high masking women who do not receive any support and in fact are often punished.
And to that, yes, it's well known that men are diagnosed at a higher rate than women. It's not necessarily that men are more likely to be autistic, but men are more likely to be diagnosed. Women mask better, as autistic women have told me. They mask better. A lot of stuff that women do will be seen as, oh, she's just a little quirky, whereas with a man it's seen more as a danger or just difference. And certain populations, people of color, as somebody said, autism is a very white male disability and how it's been treated over the years. Except Jews seem to be overdiagnosed, but that's a whole different issue. But it does seem to be, it's done from a very white male perspective.
All right, thank you. So with that, let me tell you the ending CLE code. It's Q as in Queen, S as in Sam, W as in Women, 259. So QSW 259. Thank you. Thank you both.